All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing us. Thank you for supporting us on Patreon, patreon.com/Matt Lewis. And I'm excited to welcome back today, friend of the show, David French. He's a senior editor at The Dispatch, a columnist at The Time, a senior fellow at Trinity Forum, and co-host of the great podcast, Advisory Opinions. David French, welcome back to the news.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Let me just recommend anyone who's paying attention to the Texas abortion law should go listen to your latest Advisory Opinions, which is very good. And I have to say, a lot of times when I listen to you and Sarah Isgur, at the end of an episode, I come away thinking, they made this sound really understandable. And I could have been a lawyer. If I had applied myself, I could have been a lawyer, but that was not the case. When I listened to this episode, I came away thinking, I don't think I could have done this, because this thing in Texas is really complicated, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And basically, if you're reading a news report about this and it doesn't just lead off with, this is a really unusual law where that was decided under a really unusual procedural posture, you're not getting the sense of what happened. And so, because a lot of people they just like to cut to the chase and they go, what does it mean for Roe? What does it mean for Roe? And in the Supreme Court opinion, the majority says this doesn't mean anything on the substance at all. This is entirely an artifact of this really unusual law. And then the hidden thing that's not so much in the media is it's also an artifact of a flawed litigation strategy from abortion rights supporters. And so, just to unpack that a little bit, this law is very different from other heartbeat bills. Heartbeat bills are nothing new. They've been sweeping through much of the South and part of the Midwest for 3 or 4 years now. This is different though, and that it doesn't let the state enforce the law. So no state officials can enforce the Texas heartbeat bill. Well, who enforces it? Who enforces it are the citizens of the state of Texas. Essentially what they say is, so long as you're not a state official, you can sue somebody who performs an abortion or who aids and abets in performing an abortion. You can win $10,000 plus attorney's fees if you do so. So they've
delegated. It's like a game show or a reality show.
Well, there's actually a form of litigation, and we talked about this in the Advisory Opinions podcast, called qui tam, which is that deputizes citizens to sue the government, basically, like, say, to recoup fraud money. I mean, money that was fraudulently taken from the government, and sort of deputizes citizens to police fraud. And there are people who make a ton of money doing that. But this is different. This is deputizing private citizens to enforce a heartbeat bill, which, as of right now, everybody knows violates the Roe-Casey framework. Okay, so why does all that matter? Why can't you just sue and stop that? Well, when you file a lawsuit, you have to file it against defendants, specific defendants. And the way in which you prevail is the court orders the defendants to give you the relief that you want. So if a state is going to enforce an anti-abortion law, then by enjoining, seeking an order against the state, you can stop the enforcement of the law. Well, who are you suing here? Are you suing 29 million Texas citizens? No. Are you suing the state court judges who could potentially be involved in the lawsuits? Well, that's very, very complicated. That's very hard. There's a whole legal doctrine involving that's got a lot of confusion about it.
Is that the ex parte?
Ex parte Young.
See, I listened to your podcast, David.
You did. And so what the abortion rights advocates did is they chose to sue one judge, sort of as a representative judge, and one Texas citizen as kind of a representative citizen. And that doesn't really work, because the citizen filed an affidavit and said, I'm not going to sue anybody. And the judge, well, it's up in the air whether they can even sue a judge before there's a lawsuit. And even during a lawsuit, it's really hard to do this. So the court said, you just don't have the right defendants. Now, does that mean that the law and the law is going to go into effect? Now, does that mean the law is going to stay in effect? No, because there are other ways to deal with the law. One is if somebody goes ahead and sues an abortion provider, you can mount as a defense to the lawsuit the constitutional right that's currently recognized to an abortion. Or you can do a setup case. In other words, you can go to John Smith in Austin, Texas, and say, John, could you sue this abortion doctor? And as soon as you sue the abortion doctor, they can do a bunch of things at once. They can raise their constitutional defense in the litigation. They can try to sue the state court judge to enjoin the actual litigation itself. There's a bunch of things they can do. And so arguably, if they had known in advance, it's always tough to Monday morning quarterback litigation. But if they had really thought through this defendant problem, they would have had one of these cases teed up, ready to go, just right out of the box.
All right.
So I expect they're scrambling to do something like that now.
Okay. And let me just plug again, advisory opinions. If you want, you guys talked for like an hour about
Oh
this.
my gosh.
So go there. Yeah. I learned so much, so I want you to now take off your lawyer hat and put on your evangelical hat or your political strategist hat. As Jonah Goldberg says, we wear many hats.
Yes.
Let's talk about the fallout from this. And I'm not talking about the midterms. I'm talking about if you are a pro-life person who believes in the dignity of life and wants to persuade and win hearts and minds. And we know there's already a case that's going to probably come out next June, right?
Right.
That's where the Supreme Court possibly could overturn Roe Casey. If you're a person who just cares about persuading and winning hearts and minds, does this Texas case actually undermine your argument of the right to life?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so anytime anybody is going to make definitive arguments about sort of public opinion about abortion, take it with a grain of salt. And so here's why. One, abortion has been really hard to poll for a really long time because the polling depends an awful lot on how you ask questions. And so you can generate seemingly contradictory results just by changing the way you ask a question, which is nothing new to polling, but it's particularly true in abortion where a lot of people just don't know the lingo. They don't even know what Roe v. Wade really means, what it means to overturn Roe v. Wade. But one thing that is interesting is that abortion polling, to the extent that you can do it well, is really pretty stable. Okay. And by that, I mean that there is a relatively small minority who wants abortion to be legal from conception until birth with few to zero restrictions. That's a minority. Then there's another minority that wants abortion to be illegal from conception until birth with tiny few exceptions, mainly life of the mother. Okay. So those are two minority positions. And in the middle, there's sort of this big mess, and that's where the plurality or the majority of American people are. So you've kind of got one bucket or one axis, I guess you would say, is the axis of substantive belief on abortion, where a lot of people, the critical mass of people, are somewhere in the middle between legal up to birth and flat ban. Then you have the intensity axis, which is how intensely do people feel about this issue. And there's a lot of conflicting information on that. Ryan Burge put out some information, who's a statistician of religion and researcher of religion at Eastern Illinois University, kind of a gold standard researcher, that said that the pro-abortion side, of late at least, has been more politically intense than the pro-life side. And there's a lot of research that now says this, but even amongst evangelicals, there are issues that outrank abortion, maybe even multiple issues that outrank abortion. So when you look at that, what that means is that it's going to be really, really hard to tell by going on social media how this is going to shake out, because social media is the people who are congregating on social media tend to be both disproportionately represent the ones who have the more unpopular view and disproportionately represent those who are more intensely into the issue. So if you're going on Twitter, you would think that everyone is either extremely pro-choice or extremely pro-life. That's what you would think. And totally committed to this as a paramount issue. So how is it going to work out with the vast majority of people who don't fit in those two camps? That's really hard to say. I would say this about the Texas law. It is legal gamesmanship. Okay. It is legal gamesmanship. It is a way in which you can draft a law to create, the best way to describe it, it's a way to draft a law to create a temporary deprivation of constitutional rights. Okay. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that normally when you pass a law that violates existing court precedent, it's easy to mount what's called a pre-enforcement challenge. For all the reasons I said before, you just sue the state, get an injunction, law doesn't go into effect. But because you can't sue the state here, it's really hard to do a pre-enforcement challenge. So that means you have to do a post-enforcement challenge, which means that there is going to be conduct for a time that violates existing precedent. So that's what Texas did. It engineered a way around the pre-enforcement challenge to give the state, not the state, the state, because it passed the law, the ability to violate existing precedent for some undefined period of time. Now, if you think that could be confined to abortion, I got news for you. There are ways in which legislatures can do that to impact all kinds of constitutional doctrines or all kinds of binding precedents. And so from that standpoint, as I said in the podcast, be careful what you wish for. If you're sitting there high-fiving and you say, Texas, look, you found your way around pre-enforcement challenges. Yay, go Texas. Well, what happens when, say, the state of New York says, we're going to ban the sale of all semi-automatic pistols and rifles. But we're not going to enforce the ban. But if anyone sells a pistol or sells a rifle, you can sue them for $10,000 in attorney's fees. Well, that would be flatly unconstitutional. That would be, you're talking about guns that easily fit within sort of the right to keep and bear arms. But would you be able to do a pre-enforcement challenge under existing precedent here? No, not really. Would people be prohibited from buying guns for a while that they would otherwise have a right to buy? Yeah, probably so. So this is the kind of thing that is what you would call a procedural escalation of our cultural battles.
Yeah. I just feel like, and you made the point about Twitter not being reality, and I realized that the example I'm about to give you does not represent real America either, but it's like a microcosm of the battle over media narratives. Okay, so like, I used to be a CNN contributor, so I was going on all the time, and you talk about whatever they tell you is going to be the topic, right? And I'm just imagining the last couple of weeks, I've been on offense, right? I've been able to stick it to Joe Biden because he's wrong about so many. It was easy. I had the wind at my back. I knew I was on the side that was popular. I also had the benefit of the facts on my side. And now with this, it's hard enough to go on TV, let's say, and talk about the right to life.
Right.
I know that I'm on the right side of that. I'm pro-life, okay? So I feel like I have the moral high ground, but I know the other side is going to come at me with emotional language, and they're going to bring up, emotional examples, and they're going to put up a woman against me who's going to tell me I just don't understand because I can't, they're going to play that game, and that's fine. It's hard enough, though, to defend the unborn and the dignity of life as it is. Now you want me to defend the idea that random people can sue Uber drivers? It's like that, from my standpoint, what they have done. And the court, it seemed like there was a narrative developing whereby Amy Coney Barrett, for example, had demonstrated her intellectual honesty and that she was like an honest broker who was calling balls and strikes. It would have been great to go into to next year, right? When the decision's handed down on possibly that could overturn Roe Casey, maybe um, with that. But I just feel like this complicates it. And now if I'm going to defend the right to life side, then I'm going to have to defend all sorts of weird things about random people suing, possibly following around other people. Anyway, that's a lot.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but you can do two things at once. You can defend and you can attack the Roe Casey framework, which I think is constitutionally legitimate, defend the right to life and dignity of the unborn, and then say this Texas law sets a dangerous precedent and is obvious gamesmanship. I mean, it really is. And so, the issue with and the other thing that I would say is when there a lot of people, again, you're talking about an issue that a minority of Americans feel intensely about, and a majority of Americans, they're kind of removed from it. Now, when it comes to their personal life, if someone has an unwanted pregnancy, these kinds of things get salient really fast, but not from a political standpoint so much. All right, so a majority of Americans are looking back and they're saying, "Wait a minute, was this fair? Is this fair? Can't wait. You're suing an Uber driver? What?" Because the language is really broad. It says aids or abets.
Yeah.
Performing an abortion. So, in that standpoint, that I think Texas has won.
The fact that if the person suing loses, there's no penalty for them, right?
Right.
That seems unfair to me, and it will incentivize this litigious nature. You got like essentially bounty hunters out there trying to make money doing this.
Yeah, it's a system that is the kind of thing that if it was inflicted upon you, let's say you're a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and this system was inflicted upon you, your level of anger about that would be volcanic. Your level of anger that says, wait a minute, you're finding a way to essentially game the procedural rules of court to deprive me of my constitutional rights. Now, and to put it in sort of the terms that a lot of people can really understand, the deprivation of a constitutional right, even for a very short time, the Supreme Court of the United States has said is an irreparable injury under the law. It's an irreparable injury. That's why you're able to get injunctive relief to prevent it from happening. It's because it's deemed an irreparable injury. Now, pro-lifers like me say, wait, are you kidding me? Abortion isn't a constitutional right. It's not in the Constitution. Roe Casey is illegitimate. But right now, Roe Casey are binding precedent under the law. Lower courts are bound to follow it. And so, if you're going to say, well, we can do this for abortion, but it's illegitimate for everything else, that's a political position. That's not a legal position. And believe me, other legislators will not buy that political position. They will say, oh, thank you, Texas. You have now demonstrated to us exactly how we can cleverly draw a statute that will allow me to, at the very least, really inconvenience the gun lobby or the religious right or whoever the target is of this law, deprive them of their constitutional rights for a period of time. And then, yeah, we'll probably lose over the long run, but look what we accomplished. And I think that, but that's one thing, when I say deprive them of the constitutional rights for a time, I kind of got a lot of blowback or some blowback. A lot's a strong word, but some blowback for saying, ultimately, this Texas case is still a sideshow. The main show is the Dobbs case coming up, being argued this fall, decided this summer, and where Mississippi is flat out thrown down the gauntlet and asked the court to overrule the Roe Casey framework entirely. And this Texas situation, there is going to be at some point relatively, days, weeks, going to be a court order blocking it in all likelihood. And we'll kind of move on. And then if you think the frenzy has been big around Texas, just you wait until the oral argument in the decision in the Dobbs case.
No, I wrote a piece at the Daily Beast a few months ago where I pointed people have no idea, A, the odds that Roe Casey could be overturned. And I
Mhm.
know you're skeptical
I'm
of that,
skeptical,
but
but I'm
I
getting
still
less
think
skeptical. I'm
if
getting less skeptical.
I still think if people knew the odds, they would. I don't think people appreciate that. And this is going to be a firestorm when this happens because, well, we see what's happening just now in one state of Texas,
Right.
right?
Yeah. There's a couple of ways this cuts. Okay. So one is Roe and Casey together have been destabilizing American politics now for almost 50 years. I mean, think how much our politics are now based on electing a president who's going to nominate judges who are going to rule one way or the other on this issue. And think how many people are told who are deeply uncomfortable, maybe with the Republican Party on all other counts, who are told, well, you're a baby killer unless you vote GOP.
Donald Trump probably would not have been president if it wasn't for Scalia dying and McConnell
Exactly.
holding that seat open.
Exactly. Or how many Democrats might be uncomfortable with a lot of the wokeness, the sort of the hyper wokeness that's going on, or the intolerance on the liberal left, but are convinced that the only way to preserve Roe Casey or right to an abortion is by just continuing to vote Democrat. It's had this kind of been hanging over our country, destabilizing our politics in pretty substantial and consequential ways. And so my argument is this, and I could be wrong about this, Matt. I could be totally wrong. If you overturn Roe Casey and return the issue to the states, yes, it will be convulsive for immediately after Roe and Casey are overturned. Immediately after that, it will be an absolute political firestorm. Everybody knows that. But what happens months later, years later? Well, people are voting about abortion in their own states. They have a say in this directly, and then it's not up to the president to nominate judges, and so it could de-escalate national
Oh yeah.
politics in a pretty
No,
significant way.
and I hope when I say this is going to be an S storm,
Yeah,
I hope people don't think that I think that means we shouldn't do it.
right.
Like I'm not saying this is going to be too hard. It's going to upset people, and therefore we should forget our what we've been trying to do for the last 50 years. What I'm saying is like, gird your loins, batten down the hatches. This is much more likely to happen than you think, and not you, but than most
Yeah.
people think, and it's coming sooner than you think.
Well, and here's the thing to watch out for. So, yeah, so there would be an absolute firestorm. No question. Everybody stipulates to that. My view is Roe is unconstitutional from its inception. You rule on the constitutionality of the question, and then there is I would believe, a positive side effect beyond just but beyond rectifying this monumental constitutional wrong, that over time it would actually restore the intent. It would essentially restore and bring politics on this vital question where it was supposed to be to begin with. But, and I'll say this, that firestorm could be very, very, very intense to the point of, and imagine if it's a 5-4, that Roe is overruled 5-4. There would be a monumental push towards court packing at that point. Just a monumental push. And so there would be a storm that I think the American political system would have to weather. And where it would be Joe Manchin, you got to stick to your guns. And Kirsten Sinema, you got to stick to your guns. And then after that, I think it would bring, in addition to greater constitutional fidelity, interestingly enough, a greater degree of stability and democratic participation, which would de-escalate this issue over the long run. That's my view. It's also my hope.
What you're saying is if there's not a civil war, things will in the long run be better.
Right.
Which I kind of
Yeah,
agree
that's a
with.
kind of a blunt way of putting it. But
Well, I want to turn, quickly to something you wrote this past week in your excellent newsletter. So tell me about the newsletter first. You have one a week that I think is behind the paywall, and then one that is open to everyone. Is that right?
As of now, it's 2 behind the paywall, Tuesday, Thursday, and then Sunday essay open to everybody. Then Sunday essay is religiously themed.
And how can people sign up for that?
Just go to thedispatch.com and sign up. You can be a free lister and get part of our stuff, or you can be a great American, become a paid subscriber, and get all of our stuff.
Excellent. So let's talk. You this last Sunday column. You talk about the story of it's about vaccines, and it's about unfortunately how a lot of evangelicals sadly have not gotten vaccinated. But along in part of telling that story, you talk about this quote unquote guy named Bill, and you tell the evolution of Bill. And I thought that was just a really good story to tell, because it is it's sadly indicative of a lot of Americans. But talk about this imaginary person you call Bill and his trajectory over the last decade.
Yeah. So I have several actual people in mind when I constructed this Bill person. Because going back in my career about a decade or more, I was an attorney for dozens of Tea Party groups, going back in the Obama first term, when we were talking when the Obama IRS systematically targeted conservative nonprofit applications. This is the Tea Party targeting scandal. And so I worked on a legal team that was representing Tea Party groups from across the country that had thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of members. And so I got to know these guys. And, I spent countless hours talking to them. And there was a couple of things about them. One, there was obviously a great deal of animosity for the Obama administration. And a lot of it was understandable. They just had their constitutional rights violated by the Obama administration. At the same time, there was this real enthusiasm for the Constitution. You could talk to them forever about the First Amendment. You could talk to them forever about the Second Amendment. You could talk about due process. You could talk about, there was a lot of ideologic, people were, if they were overzealous, they were overzealous ideologically. And if they were intolerant, they tend to be intolerant. You remember these days well, where, Fox News prime time was like on rhino hunts. Who is insufficiently ideologically conservative? And so a lot of these folks were all into sort of this Ted Cruz constitutional conservatism.
Jim DeMint back then, probably.
Yeah. And so they were the people who, many of them were among the last. I remember talking to multiple Tea Party, Ted Cruz Tea Party conservatives who were organizing behind the scenes and tried to organize a revolt at the Republican National Convention. And then they went ahead and voted for Trump. And then all of a sudden things began to change. So Trump wins. They're shocked. They're thrilled that Hillary is gone. And then they become anti-Trump, which is not so much against the never Trumpers, but for every Trump scandal, there was a CNN scandal. For every Trump outrage, there was an Ilhan Omar outrage. So there was always something else to be outraged, or always
this was for me, the Federalist kind of defined the never Trump or anti-Trumpism thing.
Right. You really began to tell its prevalence when on conservative media, even no matter what Trump did, it was always ultimately going to be a media scandal, because you were always going to be able to find some media figure somewhere who overreacted. And then that's the scandal. Not what Trump did, not what the president of the United States did. Yeah. It's somebody on CNN said something crazy.
This is like the inverse of the Republicans pounce thing, right?
Exactly. Media overreacts.
Yeah.
But then it began to morph into really, the way I put it is sort of, you went from holding your nose to vote for Trump in 2016 to first bass boat in the boat parade. And really 2020 was that was what tipped everything over. As soon as COVID became part of the culture war, and then as soon as the conspiracy theories around the election began to build, a lot of this just tipped over into the point where some of the exact same people who are handing out pocket constitutions, some of whom were saying, "Hey, have you ever heard of this guy Friedrich Hayek and Road to Serfdom?" That the same people that made Road to Serfdom a surprise bestseller, like in 2009, 2010, are talking about ivermectin as a prophylactic. They're talking about masks as, quote, face diapers. They're saying that the election was stolen, and they're anti-vax. They're not anti-vax general. It's the COVID vaccine. And you're thinking, what on earth happened?
What happened to Bill?
What happened to Bill? But when you think about it, what happened to Bill is Bill was always primed to do this, in this sense that Bill had a completely his identity was fundamentally partisan. His identity was fundamentally, whether you want to call it anti-left or pro-GOP, often what more became anti-left also turned into pro-Trump, because his cardinal virtue to people on the right was that he hit the left super hard. And so when your fundamental identity is resting in your partisan, your partisan affiliation or your political activism, wherever your tribe goes, you will go. And so this is the kind of thing where, for a lot of folks who are saying, how do we reach the unvaccinated? Well, for a lot of people, there is one thing that you could tell them and that clicked it over, or another thing, like they saw family members take it and be fine and that clicked over. But there's a core of anti-vaxxers for whom now it's a part of a partisan identity.
Dude, I got family.
Yeah.
And the whole thing where the people are like literally on their deathbed and like, do you wish you'd taken the vaccine? It's like, no, because the Democrats wanted me to take it. I'm telling you, thank God none of my relatives are on their deathbed, but that's where they are otherwise, some of them. Like, they would rather like feel horrible for weeks, like physically sick and risk killing other people than give the Democrats what they think is like a win. I don't know how me taking a vaccine benefits the Democrats somehow.
A vaccine developed during the Trump administration,
Yeah.
by the way, probably the Trump administration's single greatest accomplishment. And so I'm in Tennessee. I'm in suburban Nashville, where anti-vaxxing isn't super strong. It's pretty strong. It's not super strong. But you go one county south, it starts to get super strong. And we're through in the middle of a wave of Delta, which is leading to a new wave of death. And I will tell you, it's hitting people differently. When we had the wave in October, November, December, that was awful. I mean, it was terrible. It still had this feel of what we're experiencing as a natural disaster. It's like when a tsunami comes or a hurricane or whatever, tornadoes rolling through, that it's all tragic. It's all a tragedy, but it had the feel, like the cultural feel of a natural disaster. What is happening now is very different, because families are divided on this. Friends are divided on this. And so you have people who are driving home from funerals and of people who've been anti-vax, bereft. I mean, just bereft. Not, and everyone's bereft. I mean, but in a unique kind of way, that this didn't have to happen. And one thing that really bothers me, what I see online, is this sort of, Darwin evolution, this is Darwinianism, or, these people, treating them as if these deaths or these people are kind of second-class citizens and we should be less concerned about them. When the reality is, they're human beings created in an image of God, just like you and I.
Yeah. No,
And
David, we keep seeing these stories, like conservative talk show host who said this, made fun of vaccinations, dies. Is it three of them? three prominent ones that I know of in the past
I
month
know
or
Phil
so.
Valentine. I mean, I was on his
Yeah.
show a bunch back in the day.
And so I am torn as to how I feel about that. On one hand, maybe publicizing this saves lives. I also sense there's some Schadenfreude involved, though.
Yeah, I mean, the number one thing so there's unquestionably some Schadenfreude about this. Like you just, it's explicit. You read one of these stories, and then I dare you to go down. If you have any faith in humanity, I dare you to read the replies to these stories. It will dispel. It will affirm my Calvinist doctrine of total depravity of man. If you read these replies, but when the reality is there shouldn't be 1 ounce of Schadenfreude, because here's the thing: Can you imagine being somebody who is slowly becoming aware that your life is ending, and at the same time you become aware that this didn't have to happen? That has to, I mean, I can't even place my mind, or
And then
if you're a
imagine
wife or a kid.
you're becoming aware that your mortality, that you're going to die, maybe, probably. You're becoming aware that it didn't have to happen. And then people are piling on you on social
Oh,
media or making fun of you.
I can't even imagine the level of despair and heartbreak. I can't even imagine it. And at that point, to say to me, my view of that is, if you've got compassion for anybody, if you've got empathy for anybody, yeah, look, they did irresponsible things. They said things that they shouldn't have said. But just from a human standpoint, can you imagine the weight of that, the gravity of that, the sadness of that? It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. And part of me wants people to be able to communicate that heartbreak, because maybe it will spur some other people to save their lives and the lives of their loved ones. But at the same time, our culture is so freaking diseased that if you share that heartbreak, people will pounce on you like jackals.
Totally. Well, let me ask you this, and I keep thinking of that. I think wasn't there like a Lemonheads album called "It's a Shame About Ray"? It's like it's a shame about Bill.
Right.
Bill. Let's talk about Bill. And
Okay.
I'm reminding you, Jonah Goldberg always talks about. I was talking about the hats we wear, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's, your partisan hat. There's the journalist hat, the evangelical hat. There's the lawyer hat. We all. There's the husband hat, the Christian hat,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. We wear a lot of hats. These people, it turns out, the Bills of the world, their main hat was always a partisan hat,
Mm-hmm.
apparently. And I'm curious why you think that why was that the dominant hat at the end of the day?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, so one of the things that we've seen happen, this is the only period of my adult life where you can say we've all been through something. In the last 18 months since the onset of the pandemic, we've all experienced stresses as a community to greater and lesser degrees. I mean, there are people who've lost family members, and we have not. So there's greater or lesser degrees, but we've all experienced a stressor. And when you are under stress, a lot of truths and realities about yourself are revealed. My son's old basketball coach, when he was talking about the full court press, said pressure bursts pipes, and it's sort of
And it makes diamonds.
right. And so I think a lot of it is revealed. What is it that sort of is your ultimate identity? What is it that is your ultimate? What is it that gives you purpose? What is it that gets you out of bed in the morning? What is it that gives you meaning? And those of us on the right have talked an awful lot about, the great awakening, to use the phrase. Was it Matt Iglesias who first wrote about that? I can't remember, but that there is a religious zeal in politics on some quarters of the left. Well, what it has revealed on the right is that when it push comes to shove, the thing that gives people meaning and purpose in big parts of the right is politics. It's the fight. It's the battle with the left. And so what you're talking about is a matter of fundamental meaning and identity and purpose that is exposed to a greater degree in a time of stress. And so, who are you really? What is your core is something that is really revealed in times of stress. And for a whole lot of us, that core is being revealed for better and worse. I mean, there are people I know who I have seen them shine in this time. And then there are people who I have seen, be aspects of their character and personality revealed that I didn't know existed. And I know for myself, it's exposed things in myself that I don't necessarily like and that I need to work on. This has been a period of stress for all of us. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, maybe it's exposed virtues and maybe it's exposed vices. But for an awful lot of people, I think what it's done is it's revealed their fundamental bedrock identity and what they fundamentally put their hope in and their trust in. And for a disturbing number of Americans, their fundamental meaning and purpose lies in politics, political engagement, and political combat.
I think that's right. On that happy note, it's always a pleasure. How can people tell us, how can they follow you on Twitter, read your stuff, sign up for the Dispatch?
Yeah, so follow at David A. French. Poor at David French sometimes gets my hatred. But
Same thing with, try being named Matt Lewis sometime.
So at David A. French, and go to thedispatch.com and you can follow me. We've talked about my colleague Jonah, who's just always great to read. We've got great reporting and analysis. And listen to Advisory Opinions. If not for me, for my co-host Sarah Isger, who's just a delight and brilliant as well. So that's how you can follow us.
I will second that. Check it out, everybody. David French, thank you for coming back on the news.
Thanks for having me.